The morning sun streamed through the towering windows of Atlanta International Airport as Mrs. Rodriguez made her way through the bustling terminal. The sound of rolling suitcases and hurried footsteps echoed around her as she adjusted the strap of her leather briefcase, containing 15 years of aviation inspection experience in its contents. As a Federal Aviation Administration inspector, she had visited countless airports across the country, but today's routine carrier compliance check felt different. Maybe it was the extra cup of coffee she'd had that morning, or perhaps it was the new natural hairstyle she finally felt confident enough to wear to work. Her hair, styled in elegant twists, had drawn compliments from her teenage daughter, who had spent years encouraging her mother to embrace her natural beauty. The business casual outfit she wore, pressed navy slacks and a crisp white blouse, was her usual work attire. She'd chosen comfortable yet professional flats, knowing from experience that airport inspections involved hours of walking. In her briefcase, alongside her FAA credentials, she carried a tablet loaded with inspection protocols and a small notebook where she preferred to jot down her observations the old-fashioned way. Standing in line at the check-in counter, she observed the staff's interactions with other passengers, making mental notes about their efficiency and customer service, all part of her job, though no one around her knew that yet. She preferred to maintain her anonymity during these initial stages, as it usually gave her the most authentic view of airline operations. She couldn't help but notice the first-class passenger in front of her, dressed in a designer suit, receiving warm smiles and courteous service. The interaction was smooth, professional, and exactly what she expected from a major airline. As she stepped forward, her carry-on wheeling quietly behind her, she smiled warmly at the airline staff member, the same way she'd smiled at hundreds of airline employees before. The atmosphere shifted subtly as she approached the counter. The staff member's welcoming smile faded slightly, replaced by a look Mrs. Rodriguez had seen too many times before, that quick up-and-down glance that made her stomach tighten. She took a deep breath, reminding herself of her daughter's words that morning. "Mom, you look amazing. Go show them what a real professional looks like." As she placed her ID and first-class ticket on the counter, she maintained her professional demeanor, developed through years of handling difficult situations. The staff member picked up her documents, but instead of processing them, began scrutinizing them with an intensity that hadn't been shown to the previous passengers. "Is there something wrong?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked politely, already knowing this interaction was about to become more than just a routine check-in. The staff member's response would set in motion a chain of events that would not only change airline policy, but would also spark a national conversation about prejudice in air travel. Little did the airline staff know that the woman they were about to deny boarding wasn't just another passenger they could dismiss. As Mrs. Rodriguez stood there, her credentials tucked away in her briefcase, she decided to let the situation unfold naturally, knowing that sometimes the best way to create change was to let people reveal their true colors first. Around her, the airport continued its morning rush. Families hurrying to vacation destinations, business travelers typing away on laptops, airline staff directing foot traffic. None of them realized they were about to witness a moment that would eventually make headlines and change air travel protocols across the country. For now, Mrs. Rodriguez simply waited, her hand resting on her briefcase, watching as the staff member began to voice concerns about her appearance. The young airline staff member leaned forward over the counter, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "Ma'am, we have certain standards for our first-class cabin," she said, her eyes lingering on Mrs. Rodriguez's natural hairstyle. The words hung in the air like heavy smoke, making several nearby passengers shift uncomfortably in line. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand what you mean by standards," Mrs. Rodriguez replied calmly, though her heart was beginning to race. She'd faced similar situations before, but it never got easier. The morning's confidence about her hairstyle started to waver, but she pushed those doubts aside, remembering all the young women she mentored who looked up to her. The staff member cleared her throat, shuffling papers unnecessarily. "Well, your appearance." She gestured vaguely at Mrs. Rodriguez's entire outfit. "It's not quite what we expect in first class. Maybe if you were flying economy." She let the sentence trail off, the implication clear as day. A businessman standing nearby looked up from his phone, frowning at the exchange. Mrs. Rodriguez noticed his reaction from the corner of her eye. These moments of quiet witness were important too. She thought about all the people who might have stood in her shoes before, those who didn't have the power to fight back. "My ticket and ID are both valid," Mrs. Rodriguez stated firmly, keeping her voice steady. "Could you please point out the specific dress code policy you're referring to?" She knew every airline policy by heart. It was literally her job to know them. But she wanted to hear their explanation. The staff member started tapping rapidly on her keyboard, clearly flustered by the direct question. "I'll need to get my supervisor," she announced, reaching for the phone without making eye contact. Mrs. Rodriguez noticed how the staff member's hand trembled slightly as she dialed, perhaps sensing she'd stepped onto dangerous ground. While they waited, Mrs. Rodriguez pulled out her phone and quietly started recording audio of the interaction, a habit she developed over years of inspections. The morning bustle of the airport continued around them. A child laughed somewhere behind her, luggage wheels clattered across the floor, and the usual airport announcements echoed through the terminal. The supervisor appeared within minutes, walking briskly toward the counter with an air of authority. He was middle-aged, wearing a crisp uniform and a name tag that caught the fluorescent lighting. Mrs. Rodriguez watched as the first staff member whispered to him, gesturing supplely in her direction. "Is there a problem here?" the supervisor asked, his tone suggesting he'd already decided who was causing the problem. He glanced at Mrs. Rodriguez's ticket and ID, still sitting untouched on the counter where she placed them. "Yes, there is," Mrs. Rodriguez responded, her professional training kicking in. "Your colleague seems to have concerns about my appearance, though she hasn't been able to cite any specific policy violations." She paused, giving them both a chance to reconsider their position. "I'd like to understand exactly why I'm being denied boarding for a flight I'm fully qualified to board." The supervisor's response was practiced, almost rehearsed. "We reserve the right to enforce our dress code and appearance standards, ma'am. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable on a different flight." His tone carried that false sweetness that made the words sting even more. Around them, the line had grown longer, and more people were watching now. Mrs. Rodriguez could feel their eyes on her, some sympathetic, others curious, a few deliberately looking away. She thought about all the times her daughter had asked her why some people got treated differently, and how hard those conversations had been. The boarding pass printer hummed in the background, spitting out tickets for other passengers, while Mrs. Rodriguez's ID and ticket still lay untouched. She reached for her briefcase, knowing it was time to shift this interaction in a very different direction. Her fingers brushed against her FAA credentials as she considered her next move, aware that what happened in the next few moments would have repercussions far beyond this morning's flight. The situation at the check-in counter was drawing more attention with each passing minute. A small crowd had gathered, trying to appear busy with their phones while stealing glances at the unfolding scene. Mrs. Rodriguez noticed a young girl watching intently from behind her mother's legs, reminding her why moments like these mattered so much. "Let me be very clear about this," the supervisor said, folding his arms across his chest. "Our first-class cabin has certain expectations. We need to ensure all passengers feel comfortable." He emphasized the last word in a way that made its true meaning crystal clear. Mrs. Rodriguez felt her face grow warm, not from embarrassment, but from a rising sense of purpose. She'd spent 15 years ensuring airlines followed federal regulations, including those about discriminatory practices. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. A younger passenger nearby had started recording with his phone, trying to be discreet, but not entirely succeeding. Mrs. Rodriguez didn't mind. Documentation was important in cases like these. She'd learned that lesson early in her career as an FAA inspector. Could you please show me where these appearance requirements are listed in your airline's policy? She asked, her voice carrying the weight of authority she'd earned over years of experience. I'd be very interested in seeing the official documentation. The supervisor shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his colleague, who was now busying herself with reorganizing already neat piles of papers. Ma'am, this isn't about documentation. It's about maintaining our standards. Perhaps if you had dressed more professionally? He gestured vaguely at her outfit. A businessman in line spoke up. She looks more professional than half the people I've seen in first class. His comment sparked murmurs of agreement from others in line, but the supervisor raised his hand dismissively. Sir, this doesn't concern you, the supervisor said sharply, before turning back to Mrs. Rodriguez. Now, as I said, we can try to accommodate you on a different flight, or perhaps in our economy section, where the dress code is more flexible. The young staff member, perhaps sensing the situation spiraling out of control, chimed in. We're just following protocol, she added weakly, though she couldn't quite meet Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes. Mrs. Rodriguez took a deep breath, thinking about all the times she conducted airline inspections, all the reports she'd written, all the changes she'd helped implement across the industry. This moment would become another chapter in that ongoing story of progress. Actually, she said, reaching for her briefcase with deliberate slowness, I think it's time we discussed protocols in detail. Her hand brushed past her personal items, reaching for the familiar leather wallet that held her credentials. The supervisor's phone rang, and he glanced at it irritably before declining the call. Ma'am, if you're not going to cooperate, we'll need to move on to other passengers. We have a busy morning ahead. A few people in line protested, offering to give up their spots so the situation could be resolved. The solidarity touched Mrs. Rodriguez, but she knew this moment needed to play out fully. Sometimes the best teaching moments came from letting people walk right up to the edge of their mistakes. Before you make your final decision, Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice now carrying a note of authority that made both airline staff members look up sharply. I think there's something you should know about today's flight. The supervisor sighed dramatically, clearly expecting another passenger complaint. The young staff member had started to reach for the next person's ticket, assuming the discussion was over. Neither of them noticed Mrs. Rodriguez slowly opening her briefcase, about to change the entire dynamic of their morning with a simple flash of her federal credentials. The air around the counter seemed to crackle with tension as Mrs. Rodriguez prepared to reveal her true identity. Sometimes the best way to create change was to let people fully commit to their poor decisions before showing them exactly why they were wrong. I believe this might interest you, Mrs. Rodriguez said quietly, pulling out her official Federal Aviation Administration credentials. The leather wallet opened with a soft creak, revealing the golden badge and ID card that suddenly made the air feel very thin around the check-in counter. The supervisor's face went through a remarkable transformation, from smug confidence to confusion to dawning horror in the span of about 3 seconds. The young staff member behind him took an involuntary step backward, her hand flying to her mouth. I'm here today, Mrs. Rodriguez continued, her voice calm, but carrying clearly to the gathered crowd, conducting a routine carrier compliance check. Though I must say, this interaction has been anything but routine. She placed her FAA credentials next to her boarding pass on the counter. The supervisor's face had turned an interesting shade of pale. We didn't. He stammered, all his previous authority evaporating like morning dew in the summer sun. The young staff member had become intensely interested in her shoes, her cheeks flaming red. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Oh snap," and a few others chuckled nervously. The young man who'd been recording earlier was grinning from ear to ear, though he quickly tried to hide it when the supervisor glanced his way. Now, Mrs. Rodriguez said, picking up her pen and notebook, "Shall we discuss those dress code policies you were so concerned about?" She clicked her pen, the sound sharp in the suddenly quiet area. I'm particularly interested in how they align with federal aviation regulations regarding discriminatory practices. The supervisor's tie suddenly seemed too tight as he tugged at it. Mrs. Rodriguez, there's been a terrible misunderstanding, he began, his voice hitting a slightly higher pitch than before. We of course welcome you aboard, and if you'll allow me to explain. Oh, please do explain, she replied, pen poised over her notebook. I'm very interested in understanding how my professional attire and natural hairstyle fail to meet your standards. The words hung in the air like heavy raindrops before a storm. The young staff member had found her voice, though it quivered slightly. I was just following what I thought. I was trained to. She trailed off, realizing every explanation only dug the hole deeper. A child in the crowd tugged at her mother's sleeve and loudly whispered, "Mom, what's happening?" The mother shushed her gently, but smiled at Mrs. Rodriguez with obvious approval. Mrs. Rodriguez noted the time and date in her notebook before looking up. I'll need to see all your current dress code policies, training materials, and any documentation related to passenger appearance standards. Her tone was professional, but there was a hint of satisfaction in it. And I'll need them before my flight departs. The supervisor was already reaching for his phone, fingers trembling slightly as he dialed what was presumably his superior's number. Yes, sir, he said into the phone, his voice strained. We have a situation at check-in. Yes, sir. An FAA inspector, sir. Yes, about that. Meanwhile, the young staff member had begun frantically processing Mrs. Rodriguez's boarding pass, her earlier reluctance replaced by almost comical efficiency. The printer hummed to life, spitting out the first-class ticket that had been denied just minutes before. This will make an interesting addition to my report, Mrs. Rodriguez said, accepting her boarding pass with quiet dignity. Though I suspect this is just the beginning of a much longer conversation about airline policies and staff training. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse, but not before several passengers gave Mrs. Rodriguez appreciative nods or quiet words of support. The young man with the phone slipped it into his pocket, but not before giving her a thumbs up and mouthing, "That was awesome." The next 30 minutes at the check-in counter felt like watching a corporate ballet performed at double speed. The supervisor's boss arrived, slightly out of breath, his suit jacket hastily buttoned. Behind him trailed two more airline officials, all wearing expressions that mixed worry with forced professional smiles. Mrs. Rodriguez, the airline manager said, extending his hand. We cannot apologize enough for this unfortunate incident. His words were carefully chosen, like someone walking through a minefield. I assure you this doesn't reflect our airline's values. Mrs. Rodriguez observed them all quietly, her notebook open on the counter. Interesting. She wrote down something that made all the airline officials crane their necks nervously. Tell me about your staff training programs. Specifically, how do you address diversity and inclusion? The young staff member who had started this whole situation was still there, looking like she wished the ground would swallow her whole. But Mrs. Rodriguez noticed something interesting. Instead of trying to hide or escape, the young woman was listening intently to every word. We have comprehensive training programs, the manager began, but Mrs. Rodriguez held up her hand. Perhaps, she said, we should hear from someone who's actually gone through this training. She turned to the young staff member. Would you like to share your experience? The young woman's eyes widened in surprise. Nobody had expected this. She glanced at her superiors, who nodded encouragingly, probably hoping she wouldn't make things worse. The truth is, she said, her voice shaky but growing stronger, we had one diversity training session 6 months ago. It was a 20-minute video. She paused, then added, most people play on their phones through it. The manager's forced smile flickered like a faulty light bulb. Mrs. Rodriguez nodded, making another note. Around them, the regular airport bustle continued, but their corner felt like it existed in its own bubble of uncomfortable truth. And the dress code policies we discussed earlier? Mrs. Rodriguez prompted, watching as the officials exchanged nervous glances. "They're open to interpretation," one official admitted. "We should probably review them." "Probably," Mrs. Rodriguez agreed, her pen scratching across the paper. The sound made everyone wince slightly. "You'll be reviewing quite a few things, I expect." A flight crew walking past slowed down, curious about the gathering of management at the check-in counter. The supervisor, who had been quietly sweating in the background, tried to wave them away, but Mrs. Rodriguez called them over. "Perfect timing," she said. "I'd like to hear about your experiences with passenger dress code enforcement." The crew members looked at their managers, then at Mrs. Rodriguez's FAA badge, and suddenly became very candid about various incidents they'd witnessed. The young girl who had been watching earlier tugged at her mother's sleeve again. "Mom, is she a superhero?" she asked loudly enough for everyone to hear. Several people chuckled, breaking the tension slightly. Mrs. Rodriguez smiled at the child, then turned back to the airline officials. "I'll need complete copies of all your training materials, policy documents, and incident reports from the past year." She checked her watch. "You have exactly 45 minutes before my flight." The manager pulled out his phone. "I'll have everything sent to your office." "No," Mrs. Rodriguez interrupted. "I'd like to review them during my flight, in first class, where I'm apparently not dressed appropriately." The pointed reminder made everyone wince again. The next half hour was a flurry of activity. Papers were printed, files were downloaded, and a steady stream of increasingly senior airline officials appeared, each trying to smooth over the situation in their own way. Through it all, Mrs. Rodriguez maintained her professional composure, though anyone watching closely might have noticed the tiny smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. In the weeks following the incident, Mrs. Rodriguez's office became a hub of intense activity. Her initial report had sparked a much larger investigation, revealing that the check-in counter incident was just the tip of a very large iceberg. Sitting at her desk one morning, surrounded by stacks of airline records, she read through email after email from other passengers sharing similar experiences. Some had been denied boarding, others had been moved from first class, and many had simply swallowed their pride and accepted the humiliation, believing they had no power to fight back. "You need to see this," her colleague said, dropping another folder on her desk. Inside were photos from different airports across the country, showing a clear pattern. The dress code violations seemed to target specific groups more than others. The evidence was impossible to ignore. The young staff member from the airport had reached out, asking to meet. Over coffee in the FAA office building's cafeteria, she shared more about the airline's culture. "Nobody ever directly told us to discriminate," she explained, stirring her coffee nervously. "But there were suggestions, hints, unwritten rules." Mrs. Rodriguez listened, taking notes. The young woman had become an unexpected ally in the investigation, encouraging other staff members to come forward with their stories. "I didn't realize how wrong it was until I saw it through your eyes that day," she admitted. Back in her office, Mrs. Rodriguez reviewed security footage from various airports. The patterns were clear. Certain passengers faced extra scrutiny, additional questions, and random dress code checks more often than others. Her computer pinged with another email from a flight attendant wanting to share their experiences. "The airline's training materials are a mess," her team member reported, spreading documents across the conference room table. "Half of these policies contradict each other, and none of them align with federal guidelines." During a video call with other FAA offices, similar reports surfaced from across the country. "It's not just one airline," a colleague from another state shared. "This is an industry-wide problem that nobody wants to talk about." Mrs. Rodriguez spent long hours drafting detailed reports, knowing each word needed to be perfect. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about changing an entire system. Her daughter would pop into her home office some evenings, bringing her tea and asking about the investigation's progress. "You're making a difference, Mom," her daughter said one night, looking at the wall where Mrs. Rodriguez had pinned dozens of testimonials from affected passengers and airline staff. People are finally being heard. The airline's corporate offices had gone into damage control mode. Press releases emphasized their commitment to diversity, but Mrs. Rodriguez was more interested in their actions than their words. She reviewed the proposed changes to training programs, dress code policies, and staff guidelines with a critical eye. One afternoon, she received a call from the young staff member. "They're trying to change things at the airport," she reported. "But some managers are just treating it like another box to check. We need real change, not just paperwork." Mrs. Rodriguez organized meetings with airline executives, bringing hard data and personal testimonies to the table. Some tried to downplay the issues, but the evidence was overwhelming. In one particularly tense meeting, she played recordings of similar incidents from various airports, watching as the executives' faces grew increasingly uncomfortable. "This stops now," she declared, her voice firm but calm. "Either you make real changes, or the FAA will force those changes upon you." The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. This wasn't a negotiation. Late one evening, as she prepared to head home, Mrs. Rodriguez found a handwritten letter on her desk. It was from a young girl who had been in the airport that day, now inspired to become an aviation inspector herself. "You showed me that one person can make a difference," the letter read. "Thank you for standing up." Looking at that letter, Mrs. Rodriguez smiled, knowing that sometimes the biggest changes start with one small moment of standing your ground. 6 months after that fateful morning at the airport, Mrs. Rodriguez stood at a podium, addressing a room full of airline industry representatives. The changes her investigation had sparked were finally becoming reality, and she could feel the energy of transformation in the air. "Today isn't about pointing fingers," she began, looking across the crowded room. "It's about making sure every passenger is treated with dignity and respect." In the audience, she spotted the young staff member from that day, now working in the airline's newly formed Diversity and Inclusion Department. The airline had been fined heavily, but more importantly, they'd been required to completely overhaul their training and policies. The new guidelines, displayed on screens around the room, were clear and objective, leaving no room for discriminatory interpretation. During the coffee break, flight attendants and ground staff approached Mrs. Rodriguez to share their experiences with the new training program. "It's different now," one veteran flight attendant told her. "We're actually having real conversations about bias and learning how to do better." The young staff member, who had become an unexpected champion for change, was now training other employees. "I tell them about that morning," she shared with Mrs. Rodriguez, "about how wrong we were and how that moment opened my eyes. It helps them understand why these changes matter." Back at her office, Mrs. Rodriguez reviewed the latest statistics. Complaints about discriminatory treatment had dropped significantly across all airlines. Her report had led to industry-wide changes, with other carriers voluntarily updating their policies to avoid similar incidents. "Look at this, Mom," her daughter said one evening, showing her a social media post. A passenger had shared their experience of being welcomed in first class while wearing traditional cultural dress. The post had gone viral, with thousands sharing similar positive experiences. The airport where it all began had transformed. The check-in counter where she had stood that morning now displayed clear, inclusive dress code policies. The supervisor had been required to undergo extensive training and now led workshops on preventing discrimination. Mrs. Rodriguez visited different airports, not as an inspector this time, but as a speaker. She shared her story with airline staff, emphasizing how one moment of confronting bias could spark lasting change. The audiences grew larger with each presentation. One day, she received a package from a group of flight attendants. Inside was a photo album filled with pictures of diverse passengers enjoying first-class travel, along with thank you notes from crew members who finally felt empowered to stand up against discrimination. "Remember that little girl who called you a superhero?" her colleague asked during lunch. Her mother wrote to us, "The girl's doing a school project about standing up for what's right, and she's using your story." The airline industry magazines had picked up the story, but Mrs. Rodriguez was more proud of the internal changes. New training videos featured real experiences, including her own. Employee handbooks had been rewritten to emphasize inclusion. Even the airline's marketing materials now showcased a more diverse range of passengers. During her final presentation of the year, Mrs. Rodriguez shared before and after photos of airline policies. "Change isn't just about rules on paper," she told the audience. "It's about changing hearts and minds, one person at a time." As she walked through the same airport where it all began, she noticed the difference. The atmosphere had shifted. The staff was more welcoming, the passengers more diverse, and the whole environment felt more inclusive. "Your boarding pass, ma'am," a new check-in staff member said with a genuine smile, handing her a first-class ticket. Mrs. Rodriguez smiled back, knowing that sometimes the biggest changes start with one person willing to stand their ground. In her office, she kept a simple frame on her wall. Inside was her original inspection report from that day, now used as a teaching tool in FAA training programs across the country. Below it, written in her daughter's handwriting, was a simple message: "One moment of courage can change everything."